Close your eyes now. Let the edges of the day soften, but into silence. A time when no one quite understood the illness that crept from port to port, from home to home, from hand to breath. The time of the plague, and the strange, quiet figures who walked straight into its path, into cities where the streets echo with bells and the windows have all gone dark. Let the sounds around you grow distant, muted, like the last glow of dusk falling over narrow rooftops. You are safe in a quiet place, and beyond the walls of sleep, history waits. Tonight, we drift not into a palace or a battlefield. We are going back, gently, carefully, to a time when the world grew very still. The story will wait for you wherever your mind wanders. Let the rhythm of history carry you. Let the sounds and details lull you gently toward a world where something unseen has begun to move. Slow at first, then faster, then everywhere. The Plague Doctor. You may have seen the image before. Tall, cloaked in black, with a long-beaked mask, as if half bird, half man. You may have wondered who he was, why he wore such strange garb, and what he did behind closed doors where few others dared to enter. A wind picks up along the rooftops. A mother leans out her window, and somewhere, someone coughs. And how they slept. If they slept at all, this is not a story of panic or dread. It is a quiet walk through dusty streets, a glimpse into candlelit rooms. But the need for care, for presence, for someone to answer the door when all others turned away, that need was the same. A study of solitude, duty, and the soft, almost invisible boundary between care and despair. What they did each day, how they tried to understand what they could not see, and why, even now, we remember them as symbols, shadows, echoes. Tonight, you'll learn not only who these doctors were, but what they saw, what they carried, how they lived. But this will not be a frightening tale. As we move through this world, we will take our time. We will drift. Just as a fog settles over an old village, across centuries and cities, gently unfolding the story of those who stood still while others ran. Let your breath settle now. The world we are entering was different in every way. In sound, in smell, in belief, in fear. And so, through 5 unfolding segments, you will learn what it meant to be a plague doctor, who they were, what they wore. You may drift in and out as we go. That's perfectly fine. And if you do stay awake, you'll find the tale is not one of horror, but of humanity. Our first step is into the streets of medieval Europe. Before the mask, before the doctor, before the name, you are there now. The air smells of damp stone and distant fires. Bells ring far off. The arrival of the plague, a world gripped by shadows. The year is 1347. No invading army on the horizon, arriving quietly at the edge of the sea. Let them rest, he says. But not long after, whispers begin. Imagine a harbour, somewhere along the coast of Sicily. The late afternoon sun glints on the water, warm against the old stones of the dock. Seagulls call overhead, Market stalls sway in the breeze. Sailors step off the gangplanks. Then apples. The skin darkens. The breath shortens. Sometimes it took entire families in a matter of days. In the countryside, shepherds were found days later, slumped beside their flocks. In cities, entire neighborhoods were emptied. The air grew heavy. The bells rang more often. In Florence, a priest. In London, and everywhere, the sick died quickly. The doctor, the mortality, in just a few short years. Nearly a third, perhaps even half of Europe's population would be gone. Whole villages vanished. Others were paid by desperate towns, offered shelter, food, or coin if they would tend the dying. Still others were scholars, curious and unafraid, seeking to understand what the air, the blood, the stars might reveal. Doctors refused to enter homes. Later, the Black Death, though that name would only come after it had passed. Early autumn. For now, the doctor is simply a man summoned from nearby, perhaps young, perhaps inexperienced, perhaps not a doctor at all, handed a set of clothes and a ledger. The wheat stands uncut. In the village below, the truth is, most did not write about it. Many could not. But in the margins of prayer books and the ledgers of monasteries, we find quiet evidence, entries that stop abruptly, names repeated and then crossed out, pages left blank. Smoke rises from a chimney. A child's toy lies in the mud. Within days, the docks are quieter. The gulls more distant. Some fall. There is no great alarm at first. A merchant mutters that the crew seems ill. A town official frowns but shrugs. Sickness happens at sea. Not just fever, not just fatigue, but something else. Gondolas empty. A priest rose slowly from house to house, and in each town the authorities begin to ask, who will care for the sick? Offering last rites from his boat, barely speaking above a whisper. The sound of oars echoes down marble alleys, behind closed doors, and thus it begins. Would eventually lead to the creation of a new figure, a symbol of both hope and fear. A solitary presence, masked. They saw it in the eyes of neighbors, in the silence of homes that had once been full, doors closed more often. Windows were shuttered even during the day. The streets, once bustling, began to quiet, soft-footed, in the fabric of cloaks, from Genoa to Marseille, Barcelona to Venice. It followed the trade winds and caravans, the letters and cargo. In those first days, the people had no name for it. In Paris, doctors speculated that the cause lay in the stars, Jupiter and Mars. One day a man seemed strong enough to walk. The next, he was gone. The people called it many things. It did not kill like a sword or like a storm. It killed quietly, with heat and swelling and silence. Churches filled, then emptied. Coffins ran short. So did prayers. And still, no one understood why. It is difficult to overstate the scale, and into this widening silence, a figure began to appear. Not yet wearing the famous beaked mask, not yet cloaked in leather, but summoned nonetheless. Some came out of duty. But before these strange physicians walked the streets in their dark robes, picture the fields outside a town in Germany, or imagine Venice, all across Europe. Bread is still baked. Who will enter the homes that no one else dares approach? This question, asked again and again in the silence of countless cities. The plague doctor. But we are not there just yet. This is how it begins. Not with masks. You may wonder what it felt like to live in such a time. A silence deeper than the dark. Daily life before the outbreak. The rhythm of a world before the shutters were drawn and the doors closed tight. There was life. Soft, ordinary, and rhythmically familiar. Let us step back now, to just before the first whisper of plague touched the air. Imagine yourself in a modest European village sometime in the early 1340s. The day begins, as it always does, with the bells, not tolling for the dead. Not yet. These bells ring in the morning, echoing over fields and thatched rooftops, calling both prayer and labor into motion. Wheels creak. The term sleep, as we know it today, beds were shared by families, sometimes by guests, and often by necessity. Privacy was rare. Bread was the foundation. One prayed at certain times, matins, lauds, vespers. One worked until the sun lowered, perhaps in a cathedral, but for most, pottage. A kind of vegetable stew, cheese, when it could be afforded. They believed in the turning of the year, in the rising of the moon, in the pattern of the stars. A man might know no Latin, but he would know the feast days, speaking in slow, low voices, or saying little at all. A man might know the names of every neighbor for a mile. A woman might know how to dress a wound with boiled comfrey, or still a cough with warm milk and sage. A woman might not read, but she would remember the tale of a healing well. But here, in this village, or this town, or this quiet farm, life went on untouched. People made plans for weddings. They had buried the old, the frail, the young. It was part of the pattern. The murmur of evening prayer. The shadow had begun to move. Crops were planted. Shoes mended. What they thought it was. How they tried to protect themselves. Bread sliced. Letters carried. Or a holy bone. Ale, weaker than modern beer. Water, depending on where one lived. The house grew quiet, save for the pop of coals and the low breathing of those at rest, or the wind might stir gently through the trees. It was not a silence of fear. Not yet. It was the silence of routine. Meat was rare for peasants. Warmth came not just from fire. For many, it came in two parts. And second sleep, which followed a brief waking period in the middle of the night. This interval, sometimes an hour or more, was used for reflection, quiet, conversation. Yet none of this was felt as heavy or strange. It was simply the air one breathed, as natural as the changing season. Market stalls are set up beneath striped canvas. Fishmongers arrange their wares. Salted herring, eels in barrels, shrimp packed in straw. Women haggle over cloth. The light dimmed. Oil lamps flickered. The hearth burned low. Stories were told. slowly, with pauses, not dramatic, but comforting in their repetition. Tales of beasts and saints, of travelers and angels, of the curious and the kind. A monk passes quietly, nodding, his sandals soft on the stone. The sun is gentle in spring, golden through the mist that clings to the valley. Chickens scatter across a dirt path. As the baker lifts the wooden shutter, the smell of bread. Children laugh, their feet bend. A dog stirs near the doorway. This was the rhythm of life. In towns and cities, cobblestones ring with footsteps. Work and prayer divide the day. Most people, especially in the countryside, the homes were small, perhaps 1 or 2 rooms, floors packed with earth. Meals were simple. Time itself was not kept by the hour, but by bells, by light, and by habit. And in that time there was belief. People believed in saints, in relics, in miracles, and penance. The world was layered, part physical, part spiritual. Illness came from imbalance, fortune from divine favor, sin from forgetting one's place. Children played in the dust, carved whistles from twigs, and balanced on walls. The elderly sat on benches beneath wooden eaves. Evenings came early, and then came sleep. First sleep. The body slowed. These were the days just before everything changed. Somewhere, far away, the illness had already begun to spread, and even in the cities, where rumors sometimes rose, few could imagine the scale of what was coming. They had seen illness before, yet beneath that surface, behind the clink of coins, the song of the market, soon the streets would quiet. The shutters would close, not just for sleep, but for protection, and a new figure would begin to appear. But before we meet him, the plague doctor himself, we must understand what the people believed about the illness that now arrived. When breath became a mystery, illness was not a measurable force. It was something that entered like wind through a crack, like sin into the soul. It arrived, invisible, and changed everything. To understand the world of the plague, a man might wake in the morning with only a heaviness in his limbs, a little sweat on the brow. The lump grows, a boil, or as they called it, a bubo. Hard, hot, ominous. By midday, a fever burns behind the eyes. The skin flushes. He lies down. He says, he thinks perhaps he has overworked himself. Astrologers noted that in March of 1345, a rare conjunction had occurred. Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars aligned in the 40th degree of Aquarius. It was said to have heated and corrupted the air, sending harmful rays, a scourge sent by God for the sins of humanity, for pride, for greed. And so, in cities across Europe, beating their own backs with cords or iron-tipped whips, their chanting filled the narrow streets. They sought forgiveness. They sought to cleanse not the body, but by the next morning. There were different forms of the disease, now known to us as bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague. One spread through bites, one through breath, but at the time, it was all part of one terrible, unknowable wave. Those who entered often held a sprig of herbs to their nose, breathing through the scent. If the person died, sometimes buried with them, sometimes locked in the house and abandoned, a lump, sometimes beneath the arm, sometimes at the groin, tender, firm, painful. The skin grows taut, the color darkens to the bonds between people. A priest might continue to visit the dying, offering whispered prayers behind a veil of cloth. Compassion, though often quiet and frightened, perhaps skeptical or curious or simply brave, he would enter these homes, record these deaths, offer what little help he could. The breath shortens, fasted, but in a world where the cause could not be seen, where death came silently and swiftly, it was comfort, structure. But even then, he was marked by contract, by dress, by fear, a figure set apart. Hope. Some abandoned their possessions and wandered. The lips turn dark, the fingertips cool. Some bleed from the nose, more personal. Some cough. They avoided neighbors. They spoke in hushed tones. When a family member fell ill, rubbed garlic on their feet, tied dried toads to their legs, hung amber beads around their necks. Some placed coins in vinegar before using them, hoping to cleanse what hands could not, whispered prayers, applied herbs, cried in silence. The fear of the unknown. History bears witness to these tragic moments, when sorrow sought a scapegoat. Some fall unconscious, and many. This belief led to the burning of herbs in the streets, the hanging of flowers in homes, and the lighting of incense. Sweet smells were thought to protect against foul vapors, even the famous beaked mask of the plague. Doctor would later be packed with fragrant items, lavender, cloves, dried roses, not for comfort, but as a shield. It could be 5, but rarely more. Bloodletting, laxatives, but the results were rarely good. These signs became well known, but they were not well understood. The medical knowledge of the time relied on ancient Greek and Roman texts. These texts spoke of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health, they said, came from balance, illness from imbalance. A person with too much black bile might be melancholic, too much phlegm, sluggish, and so, when the plague came, it was thought to be caused by an excess or corruption of the humours. Doctors prescribed purges for those not schooled in medicine. Some believed the air itself had turned evil, that it was miasma, bad air, that caused the plague, thick, putrid, and invisible. To many, this seemed as valid as any other cause. The stars, after all. There were also those who saw the plague as divine punishment. In villages, people hung crosses above their doors, prayed more fervently. Accusations were leveled often against outsiders, travelers, or marginalized communities. But for most, the response to plague was quieter. They stayed indoors. The symptoms were not always the same, and so people did what they could. They wore charms. In homes where the sick lay, windows were covered. The smell of vinegar and smoke filled the rooms. People did not always fear the disease alone. They feared what it did to order. And yet, Even in this time of fear, there was care. A mother might risk her life to soothe the child. A neighbor might bring bread to a sick family. The beliefs of the people, though strange to modern ears, were part of an attempt to understand, to protect, to survive. It is easy, now, to view these superstitions as naive. And in this storm of symptoms and symbols, one figure would soon begin to stand out. A man, perhaps, newly trained. He would not yet wear the mask we now associate with him, the plague doctor. In the service of suffering, the doors were closed. The bell of the parish church tolled more often than it rang for mass. Across the towns and cities of Europe, the world had changed. Quietly, pervasively, and within that stillness, a question hung in the air, spoken first in whispers, then aloud. Who would tend the sick? Who would count the dying? Who would enter the homes that others feared? Before the figure we now call the plague doctor emerged in his dark robes and beaked mask, before the profession took on its symbolic form, there were others, the early responders, physicians, yes, but also clerics, barbers, monks, herbalists, and healers of humbler training. The first line of care was rarely scientific. They know of poultices, of leeches, of prayers, to Saint Sebastian, patron of plague victims, but they cannot cure. Someone to make sense of the dying. His tools are simple. They would hire a man, sometimes a physician, often not, and offer him shelter, payment, and protection in return for his service. A knife, a bowl, unofficial, untrained, often unpaid. It was not uncommon for plague doctors to succumb themselves. Some were young men, newly trained. A clerk, a scholar, or even a wandering student might take the job if no one else would. The need was great. Others were older, with few other prospects. A doctor might spend hours with a patient, offering herbs, draining buboes. Some risked their lives, not only out of obligation, but out of belief, in duty, in purpose, in the strange dignity of staying when others left. A walking stick, or cane, to maintain distance, sometimes a small satchel, and always a sense of removal from society, from normal life. Their lodgings were sometimes provided by the city. Interaction was limited. They speak of long days, of towns that seemed emptied overnight, of whole families taken. They describe the routine of death as something almost mechanical. Yet between the lines, a quiet grief sometimes surfaces, not in cries, but in the rhythm of repetition, and though their work was essential, they were rarely thanked, at least not openly. Their work born of necessity more than doctrine. He was to visit the sick, record names, confirm deaths, witness, and, if possible, in many cases, he was forbidden to leave the city for the duration of the plague. They tried what they could, poultices of vinegar, lancing of boils, encouragement to rest, but they knew, deep down, that their power was limited. They were not miracle workers. They were witnesses. Some contracts specified his freedom would be revoked if he tried to flee. But in these early years, bandages boiled in wine. The sick are countless. The dead, beyond counting. And the cities, desperate to restore order and control, begin to formalize the role of the plague doctor, not only in task, but in appearance. His hands are not always steady, and his success not always evident, but he does what he knows. His presence was not associated with healing, but with finality, with formality. He was the hand that sealed the ledger. Yarrow for fever, lavender for calm, mint for the stomach. She does not promise a cure. They offer water, cloth, last rites. It was often spiritual, often improvised, and always personal. Imagine a monastery on the outskirts of a French town. Its stone walls are cold, worn smooth by centuries of weather. Inside, the monks move with slow purpose, tending to the sick in a wing now overfilled. Buckets of herbs simmer on the hearth. Psalms are sung softly, not for show, but for comfort. These monks are not medical men in the modern sense. Elsewhere in town, following ancient texts that speak of balancing the humors, and in villages where no doctor resides, the wise woman, often older, often widowed, often quiet, gathers herbs in the woods. These were the first healers, but soon cities began to realize that something more structured was needed, not just compassion. And so the plague doctor was born, not as a symbol, not yet as a costume, but as a function. In cities like Florence, Venice, and later London and Prague, the authorities created contracts. The job was difficult, dangerous, and deeply isolating. A plague doctor's contract usually included specific terms. The payment was often substantial, more than a normal doctor might earn. But with it came the high risk of death, and some were not doctors at all. Historical records show that, at times, the role was filled by those with only a rudimentary knowledge of medicine. In some cities, multiple plague doctors were appointed. He would carry with him a ledger to record deaths. It's important to understand that while some plague doctors were respected, many were feared. To see him at your door meant confirmation. Yet there were moments of care, too. Still, it was a lonely role. And always, for most plague doctors, the answer was unclear. In time, their appearance would change. The mask, the coat. As we leave this first segment, we find ourselves at a turning point. The plague is no longer just rumor. A new image begins to form. Who became a plague doctor? By now, the plague has made its mark. Cities echo with absence. Villages mourn in silence. Fields go untended. Churches overflow not with congregations, but with the dead. And amid the sorrow, to imagine the life of a plague doctor, we must first understand the man inside the mask. Before he was draped in leather, before the long beak marked his presence in the streets, who was he? What sort of person stepped into this strange and sorrowful profession? It may surprise you to know plague doctors were often not the esteemed medical men of their day. He could not flee. If he fell ill, in some regions, plague doctors were treated with cautious gratitude. In others, they were feared, even reviled. The sight of a doctor arriving at one's door was rarely welcome. It meant confirmation. It meant the plague was inside the walls. These men flawed, frightened. Michel de Nostradam, others, like the Venetian, Dr. Giacomo Passerini, left behind notes and observations that hinted at both medical curiosity and a quiet sadness. And they did so not just once, but day after day, in town after town. If he died, the most celebrated physicians, those who treated the nobles, the wealthy, the bishops, and the lords, rarely exposed themselves to the hazards of the plague. Promises of land, exemption from taxes, and the carts had stopped rolling through the streets. The possibility of future appointments, taken up the cane, the ledger, the mask. But the work was still hard, the danger very real, but always he was provided with certain things: a ledger for keeping names, a walking stick to maintain distance, and clothing meant to separate him, however symbolically, from the disease. Instead, the job often fell to those on the margins of the profession, but not for long. But most shared common traits. Imagine a man in his late 20s, names on contracts, faded notes scrawled beside accounts of the dead, in the shuttered rooms, walking alone with cane in hand, mask tight to their face, and the smell of vinegar and cloves thick in their nostrils. A recent graduate from a university in Padua or Montpellier. Others, a few, perhaps, hoped to unlock the secrets of the disease, but many accepted out of necessity, because the position was available and no one else would take it. Once a respected surgeon. Perhaps he is a foreigner, or perhaps he is not a doctor at all, but a clerk, a scribe, a literate man willing to wear the robes and keep the records. He has studied Latin, but he has no wealthy patrons, no position at court, and no steady patience. When the town council of a nearby village offers him a contract, or perhaps it is an older man. Each contract was different. A plague doctor was bound by agreement, sometimes formal, sometimes little more than verbal, to remain in the afflicted city for the duration of the outbreak. In some cities, respect was inconsistent, yet still, someone had to go. To be a plague doctor was not always a path of honor, but it was, in its own strange way, a form of public service. Some gained a measure of fame, but most are nameless. We know them only through records, brief entries in ledgers. To be a plague doctor was to live at the edge of death, and to carry that silence with you, always, even when the robes were removed, even when the doors were closed, even when the wind had shifted, and the bells had quieted. And so, the question remains, would you have done it? Most in their time would not, but a few did. The contract and role. Imagine now a quiet chamber, a small timber-framed room in a town hall or guild office. The window is cracked open to let in the late morning breeze, thick with the scent of damp earth and burnt herbs from the nearby market. The sun filters through uneven glass, casting pale squares on the wooden floor. Its weight is in what it means, in what it requires. At the far end, and before him, he could not refuse a visit to a poor family in the slums, or neglect a servant in a noble house. Disease did not discriminate, and so neither could he. Between them lies the contract, signed off on inheritances. Inside were names. Each line represented a life paused or ended, and the pages filled quickly. noted the status of entire households. A letter, perhaps, from a town official thanking him after the plague had passed. A small sum granted to his widow. A line in a chronicle. Here worked a good man. He came when others would not. A threshold. A quiet keeper of endings. Sometimes he was the only literate presence in a home. His notes might determine who inherited a bakery, or whether a widow remained in her house. It is not long, a few paragraphs written in practiced, looping Latin. But its weight is not in words, or paper, or wax. The man is told what will be expected. He will visit the sick. He will treat the ill if he can. But more often than not, he worked alone. His days were long. The doctor was not to overcharge the sick. He was not to enter into suspicious arrangements. In some cities, there were stipulations about cleanliness, about reporting unusual symptoms, about not practicing sorcery or other forbidden arts. In the mornings, he walked the streets, cane in hand. He did not need to speak to inspire fear or hope. The knock at the door was enough. A man who may have feared his own breath, who may have held his own hand to his brow at night. A quiet wing of a monastery or a cottage on the edge of town. There he would remove his clothing, cleanse his hands in vinegar, burn dried herbs, and wait for sleep that came slowly, if at all, checking for warmth, listening for a cough. A man who may have wondered in quiet moments whether he had made a terrible mistake, or whether, in some small way, he had answered a higher calling. The dark figure on the edge of the square, the slow, measured pace, through alleyways, once full of laughter. In the afternoons, housewives drew shutters when he passed. In the evenings, he answered new calls, urgent and fearful, and report on those he cannot. He will remain in the town, not for a week or a month, but for as long as the disease lingers. He will not leave. He may not travel freely. In some cities, his heirs were promised a portion if he died. During his term of service, that clause, quietly noted near the bottom, was a reminder. His work is not only medical, it is civic, clerical, and symbolic. The plague doctor's role, you see, was often broader than one might expect. He was not just a healer. He was not just a recorder. Though records were essential, he was a presence, a structure within the chaos, a reminder that even as the world unraveled, someone remained to count, to mark, to witness. Numbers, legal records, deaths had to be confirmed for property to pass, for taxes to be adjusted, for civic operations to resume. The doctor, in this sense, was as much a bureaucrat as a caregiver. Some contracts specified that the doctor must attend all those afflicted. He might be paid in coin, sometimes a daily wage. The city councils who hired plague doctors did not always do so out of benevolence. They needed order. He bore witness to last wills, and so he carried a ledger, often wrapped in leather, in larger towns. The doctor might be assisted by an attendant, someone to carry supplies, or to help with documentation. There were few breaks. The terms of the contract also made note of conduct, and though he wore no badge of office, his very presence was a symbol. Children were warned not to follow him. Yet beneath the symbolic weight of his role, the plague doctor remained human. A man with a body that tired. At night, he might return to his rented quarters, a sparse room in a guest house. Sometimes, between entries in his ledger, we find marginal notes, a short reflection, a date changed and corrected, and though most left no memoirs, the role, though shaped by law and duty, often exceeded its written terms. It became something else, something harder to name. A plague doctor, the outfit and the mask, dressed in distance. The sun barely grazes the damp stone. A breeze rolls in, off the lagoon, dressed entirely in dark layers. He walks not with urgency, but with measured calm, in his hand, over his face, a mask, with a curved beak, tall, still. The people do not greet him. They turn inward, to keep the air, the touch, the sweat of the sick from clinging to him. Shutters ease closed. These hands will hold ledgers. They are not built for speed. No part of the skin is left exposed. Bottles, canes, shaped like the beak of a bird. At its tip, small holes drilled into the nostrils. Inside, and within that dried herbs, it announces his role, a signal from afar that one should not approach. Perhaps a slice of citrus, not patience, if he can help it. At the time, it was thought that disease travelled through miasma, foul air, and sweet-smelling herbs held near the nose might purify that air. Children are drawn away from open doorways. It allowed the doctor to approach without being approached, to observe without being touched, to act without being drawn into grief. It was, in a way, a kind of armor, not just against disease. To meet the gaze of a plague doctor is to meet one's own reflection, small, distorted, silent, a rosary, but for those who wore it in truth, a charm, a small pouch tied to the belt, tiny gestures of belief tucked behind layers of leather. Let us dress him, piece by piece, not quickly, not with haste, but with quiet care. For every layer is a boundary. Every item is meant not only to protect, but to transform, turning a man into something less human, and perhaps, in that way, to guide patients at a distance. Some wore cloth, robes, some leather, some masks were short, some lacked lenses, but the image persisted, especially in later centuries. The cloaked figure, faceless and slow-moving, to test for consciousness with a gentle prod. It is his extension, like the mask, like the coat, allowing him to interact without crossing the invisible line of danger. Simple garments, soft against the skin. Over these, the doctor dons a long overcoat, often made of heavy waxed fabric or treated leather. Every seam a barrier. The outfit was meant for protection, but offered little true defense. The fabric might repel droplet, the herbs might mask odor, but against the bacteria we now know as Yersinia pestis, it is dark, sometimes black, sometimes brown, and falls to the ankles. But what exactly is he wearing? Let us slow time now. We begin with the base layer, a shirt and breeches of linen or cotton. This coat is his shell. Its purpose is not style, but separation. Beneath the sleeves, every edge is sealed. Over his hands, the gloves creak faintly when he flexes his fingers. Then the boots, stiff soles, that echo against the stone streets. And finally, it is long curved. It is a filter, or what was believed to be one. The eye holes of the mask are often fitted with glass lenses. They reflect the world. Over the mask, he may wear a wide-brimmed hat, part symbol, and in his hand, always, the staff or cane. It is more than a walking stick. It is a tool of measurement, to point, to lift the sheets of the sick without touching them. When fully dressed, the doctor is something other than a man. He is a symbol. He is a presence. The outfit was not uniform across Europe. It is a strange irony, and yet it mattered to where the outfit was to enter a role. Some doctors added their own touches. In time, the image became almost theatrical. A mask worn in carnivals, in plays, in engravings, and the dying were everywhere. Instruments for the quiet work of dying now. The figure is fully dressed. The mask is secured before he steps into the shadowed doorway of the next home. Before he crosses the wooden threshold into a room where candles flicker low and breathing is shallow. He gathers what he needs. Not modern instruments, not the precision equipment of clean white clinics and bright overhead lights, but quiet objects, some practical, some hopeful, all carried with care. A small satchel, worn, soft at the edges, hangs at his side. Within it, his tools. It is the memory of a moment that no one wants to remember. Sometimes only a first name. Sometimes the entire family is listed on the same page, one after the other, like stones laid side by side, to wipe sweat from the brow, to protect the doctor's hands, if gloves were not enough. Cleaned often, used to administer mixtures, perhaps a thick herbal syrup, or a concoction of vinegar and honey, a quiet source of strength, a reminder that he was not entirely alone. Some remedies were made from ground pearls or crushed emeralds. Others were simpler. Wine infused with sage, or milk mixed with dried petals. This would be used to lance a bubo, a painful and uncertain procedure. These were sprinkled in rooms. There might be a wax seal and a small pot of ink. On last wills, on letters from the dying to those they would not see again. The signature, the finality, the notes, not always clear. He would apply a salve, speak a word, check a pulse, and sometimes he would close the eyes of the departed gently and write a final line in the ledger, but with the slow, steady rhythm of someone who had accepted the reality of what could and could not be done. Comfort, sometimes. Ritual, always. He laid them out on tables, on stools, and between visits, but symbolic, comforting, anchoring. The cloth was boiled. The mask wiped with vinegar. The satchel hung by the door, waiting for the next call. The idea was to release the corrupted fluid, to drain the body of disease. Success was rare. Relief, if it came at all, was brief. The vinegar may be used to clean the hands, to rinse cloth, or to soak coins before exchanging them. Vinegar, sharp and sour, was thought to have purifying properties. It could cleanse, it could ward off evil air, it could bring a sense of control in a world that had none. The doctor knew that, but they offered something else: the dignity of effort, the reassurance that someone came. Nor you. Let us open that satchel now, gently, and take a look inside. Its pages are thick, rough to the touch, smelling faintly of dust and ink. It is not a journal, not a place for thoughts, but for record. The first item is often a ledger, a heavy book bound in leather or simple wood cover. Each entry follows a familiar rhythm: name, age, street, symptoms, condition. Sometimes there are blanks. These were used not only to refill the beak of the mask, but to burn in homes. Their smoke drifting through the sick room in slow, curling spirals. The scent was strong, earthy. It is the history of a town in fragments. Next to the ledger are small vials of vinegar, clear glass. Beside the vials is a bundle of dried herbs, tied neatly with twine. Rosemary, sage, thyme, sometimes bay leaves or wormwood. A small scalpel might also be present. There are cloth strips, too, torn from linen. A wooden spoon. There are also pouches of powder, a mixture of spices, ground flowers, and sometimes even ground bone. And for those of a more spiritual bent, the doctor might carry a rosary or a small wooden cross, not to preach, but to hold. Occasionally, and among these objects, the jars, the strips of cloth. Few of these items saved lives. He carried them from house to house, and then he would knock softly. In some towns, a bell would ring before the doctor entered, a warning to the neighbors. In others, his silhouette alone was enough. He would step inside, and the work would begin again. Not loud, he would listen. These were his tools, not flashy, and in a time when so much was invisible, uncertain, and feared, even small rituals had great power. A day in the life of a plague. Doctor, let us begin in silence. The plague doctor wakes, not to the sound of a bustling city. Thin morning light filters through a narrow window. The air is cool, tinged with the dry scent of burned herbs. Outside, the town barely stirs. It is the early hours, and the day begins again. Not with urgency, but with ritual. Enough to steady the hands, not enough to distract the stomach. He speaks to no one. If there is an attendant, he rises slowly from his bed. There is no luxury in this space. A basin of water stands at the corner, cold from the night. A strip of linen towel hangs nearby. He washes his hands, carefully, from habit more than hope. Far off, the distant toll of a church bell. A call not to service, but to mourning. The familiar scent of dried lavender and clove fills his senses, softening the edge of the air. He adjusts the straps with fingers that have done this hundreds of times. Each tie is a small act of intention. The shutters are closed. The door slightly ajar. A woman lies on a cot in the corner, motionless. A child sits nearby. The air is warm, thick with the scent of vinegar and sickness. He crosses the threshold and pauses. No reply. He is a reminder of something everyone wishes to forget. a ritual, a reminder. The water does not cleanse disease, he knows, but it marks the beginning of the day, a line drawn between rest and duty. He is asked to confirm the state of the patriarch. He enters the large house. The wealth is evident. Tapestries, fine floors, the air sweet, with incense. But death makes no distinction. A woman who begs to be saved. Barely. The doctor witnesses the will. He writes the man's name. He does not linger. He opens it anyway. In one alley, in another, he opens his ledger carefully and writes name, if known, address, symptoms, state. He asks questions. Name, when the fever began, what symptoms have shown. The strap leaves a line across his skin when removed. No grand conclusion, only the silent acknowledgement that tomorrow he will do it all again. He undresses slowly. The coat is wiped down with vinegar. Confirmed. Dates added. Notes made. Then the ledger is closed. He breathes deeply, now without the scent of herbs. Only air, cool and thin. He records, offers a sign of the cross, sometimes closes the eyelids, sometimes speaks a prayer. If not, he observes, those who see him. He eats little, a sip of watered wine. He eats a little cheese. He washes his hands again, sharpens the nib of his quill, reviews the morning's entries. Over 20 names already, some revisited tomorrow. He leaves a pouch of herbs beside the bed, tells the child how to steep them in water. There is no prescription, no guaranteed relief, only an effort. Then the dressing begins, orders the door to be marked. In some towns, this is done with chalk. In others, with a nailed sign. It is not meant to shame, only to warn, layer by layer. He dons his garments, linen, then leather, and finally the mask. His ledger is wrapped and placed in his satchel. His cane rests beside the door, and then, without ceremony, without farewell, he steps outside. The street is empty. Dust curls at the edges of the stones. He walks with slow, deliberate steps. The cane taps softly on the cobblestones. He is not chased, not threatened, but he is avoided. His first stop is a narrow home, halfway down a sloping alley. Slowly, he pushes the door inward. The room is dim. He does not speak loudly. He never does. His words are calm, low, measured. He checks the woman's pulse. He notes the swelling. A small cloth is dampened with vinegar. He presses it to the woman's forehead. He leaves the house as he entered it. Slowly, without drawing attention. Another line in the ledger. Some visits are brief. The patient has already passed. Others take more time. A man with fever and no family. A child. Recovering, perhaps. In one home. He encounters a body left for days. No family remains. He makes the note. By midday, he returns briefly to his quarters. In the afternoon, a prominent family has fallen ill. The man is still alive. As the light begins to fade, smoke rises from chimneys. At the final house of the day, he finds a note pinned to the door. All gone, it says. And then he walks home. The mask is heavy now. The earbs inside have lost their sharpness. The ledger is opened once more. The day's entries reviewed. No final thoughts. And again, or until he. Public health and quarantine now. Shift your gaze upward. From the footsteps of the solitary plague doctor to the broader view of the town, the city, the state, a wider rhythm emerges. Streets once alive with chatter and commerce, now pulse more slowly, muffled by fear, guarded by law. When the plague came, it did not knock at the door of a single house. Venice, for example, established protocols as early as the 14th century that would shape how societies responded to contagion for centuries. Ships arriving in Venetian ports from suspected infected regions were required to anchor offshore for 40 days before docking. This period, though based on both biblical numerology and practical observation, became a defining ritual. It was not perfect. Ships could still carry rats, and with them, fleas, but it was a beginning. It crept through neighborhoods, crossed rivers, and as it spread, entire homes of the infected were sealed, boarded from the outside, with food passed through small windows, markets suspended. These records inform decisions: which districts to seal, which roads to block, when to declare a town clean once more. Public gatherings banned, bells told not to summon. If one member of the household fell ill, escape was nearly impossible. For some, this was a sentence. For others, a strange mercy. To suffer among family. It was also spiritual and symbolic, one of containment. What emerged, slowly and unevenly, was an early system of public health. Masseuse for the dead were held constantly. Travelers were turned away, even if desperate, even if ill. Those caught sneaking in could be jailed, even executed. Fear made boundaries fierce. In some towns, the volume of deaths was so high that priests performed communal last rites. Raising a hand, it allowed the fiction, wore his mask not only for protection, but as a passport through forbidden spaces. Water, firewood, a midwife, perhaps a priest. Letters were pierced with metal rods and dragged through smoke. The plague had made everyone cautious, creative, and weary. These essentials were delivered in silence, eyes turned away. In some places, these efforts were rudimentary, little more than panicked closures and prayers. In others, they were surprisingly advanced. The cornerstone of these efforts was the quarantine. They sought divine intervention, forgiveness, mercy. But as understanding shifted, these gatherings were later discouraged, seen as risks for further spread. The word itself comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, 40 days. On land, similar measures followed. In Marseille, carriers were licensed to remove corpses from homes, often under the cover of night, their carts moving through empty streets. Entire neighborhoods were sealed. Guards, often poorly paid and fearful. A neighbor who saw someone leave a sealed house might report it. A merchant might refuse silver from an unfamiliar hand. Fear disciplined where law could not. But still, there was method in the fear. These were early threads in what would become modern epidemiology. even if few at the time understood what they were truly fighting. Their orders were simple: let no one in and no one out. Food and supplies, coins, if exchanged, were soaked in vinegar. Letters were sprinkled with powdered herbs or singed at the edges. In larger cities, the infected were sometimes relocated to plague houses, communal shelters for the ill. These were not hospitals as we know them, but rather spaces for the sick to be isolated. Conditions varied. In some places, care was provided. In others, in Milan, a more brutal approach was taken. Elsewhere, city gates were closed. Nor you. The authorities also relied on registrars of death, notaries, clerks, sometimes the plague doctors themselves, to document and report mortality numbers. Processions were organized, at least early on, of the devout, walking through the streets, chanting prayers. Churches rang morning bells, and through it all, in Florence officials issued lists of forbidden actions. No looting of the dead, no robbing of graveyards, no opening of shops in infected quarters. These public efforts were not always successful, and among the population, a strange obedience took hold. People complied, not always out of respect for authority, but out of resignation. The plague made enforcers of everyone. Of course, not all responses were so measured. Some cities closed their gates, not just to outsiders. Towns turned inward. And yet, within these walls, literal and metaphorical, life continued in reduced form. People still needed bread. In some cities, messages were sent using long sticks, the sender at one end of a canal, the receiver at the other. Still, the idea of quarantine endured. For the plague doctor, these barriers became familiar. He passed through checkpoints. He belonged to no one and everywhere. A figure in the margins, a quiet keeper of thresholds. When goodbyes were whispered, in a time of plague, the earth became restless, turned and dug again and again by hands grown numb with repetition. Burial was no longer a sacred pause in the rhythm of life. It was the rhythm, a procession without music, a farewell without embrace, a closing of the eyes done swiftly. Before the plague, death had ceremony. A parish priest would arrive with oils and prayer. The dying were surrounded by family. A will might be spoken, a sin confessed. Candles would be lit. Psalms whispered. The soil is heavy, the air always tinged with the scent of earth and smoke. The parish graveyard. Some arrive wrapped in cloth. Some are left by doorways with names pinned to their chest. Others are unnamed, unknown, offering final rites through windows or at the threshold, never crossing inside. In cities where clergy were overwhelmed, a whispered Latin phrase. The survivors, if there were any, fled, or locked their doors and turned inward, their grief unspoken. And then the door closed. Laughter. The loss was too constant, too vast. And so life folded itself around death, continued alongside it, not in defiance. The body washed, clothed in clean linen, stretched thin across too many losses. But as the numbers grow, the ceremony begins to thin. But he carried them in ink and memory, through the quiet streets. These were the Dongs Macabre, a reminder that death came for all, rich and poor, devout. Life contracted, yes, but it did not vanish. Orders given for the proper disposal of infected corpses. In some towns, the burial of plague dead was restricted to nightfall. In others, bodies were burned, not from malice, but from desperation, when burial was no longer feasible. In Paris, the cemetery of the Ina became so full that the bones of earlier burials, but all remembered the silence, the slow carts, the fields of fresh earth. Later, these bones would be moved again, but when the plague came, the pace of dying changed. And so, too, did the customs. Imagine a small town on the outskirts of Siena. At first, crosses are marked, a layer of earth. Others had nothing but the clothes they died in, mass graves, or plague pits. Long trenches are dug beyond the town walls, earth removed by teams of laborers, sometimes volunteers, more often criminals, or the desperately poor. To write it carefully, the dead are brought in carts, laid gently when possible, tumbled together when not, but in others the bells fell silent, not by choice, but by exhaustion. The bell ringers ill, or already buried themselves. Some were buried with icons, small wooden crosses, rosaries clutched in hand. The living did what they could. In some towns, the tolling of the passing bell continued, one chime for each soul. For some, there was no time to mourn. Entire families vanished within days. For others, grief took strange shapes. In Siena, in Paris, in London, chroniclers describe a kind of numbness that settled over the people. The art of the time reflected this shift. Wall paintings, once filled with saints and kings, began to show new figures, skeletons. It was not a punishment. It was simply inevitable. Graveyards expanded beyond the city, and yet, even amid this collapse of custom, some families found ways to say farewell. A lock of hair, tied in cloth, a small token buried in the garden, a whispered name each night before sleep. The plague doctor, too, played a role in this silent mourning. He might be the only one to witness the final breath, the only one to record the name. He did not always know the stories of those he buried. Over time, cities adapted, and through it all, windows were shuttered, but candles were still lit. Bread was still baked. Children still played, though more quietly. It bent, reshaped itself, flowed like water around the weight of mourning. And when the plague receded, as it eventually did, the people emerged, changed. Some carried scars, visible or unseen. Some bore grief like a second skin. And yet, the world turned on. How plague changed daily life, the rhythm of life. Distorted, but ongoing. As the plague settled into its grim rhythm, not a sudden storm, but a long, slow season. Not as it was, not as it had been remembered, but in a new, cautious form. The living adapted. A town that has already lost a third of its people, perhaps more. There is no fresh silk from the east. Fields went unharvested. In response, some landowners offered higher wages to keep workers. An early sign of economic transformation. born not of progress, but of loss. Love continued, but engagements were delayed. Others had lost their faith altogether, questioning a world where so many innocent souls had been swept away, yet others clung more tightly than ever. In some regions, news traveled slowly. A story of a doctor who had survived, a noble who had fled to the countryside and built walls so high that even the birds could not see over them, fearing they might not survive to set a proper table. Local goods dominate. Doors once painted bright now bear chalk marks and faded cloth signs. The marketplace opens only twice a week now. Why had the rich survived more easily? What of the stars? Still others to old wisdom, hidden in herbs and weather and dreams. 1,000 private philosophies were born in silence, as each household made sense of the world in its own way. Paintings were commissioned again, a new chapel roof was built. Toys simpler, a kind of before and after, not in history books, but in the very bones of daily life. Stories passed from parent to child took on new meaning. Tales of saints, and even then, few speak above a whisper. Trade is done at arm's length, bread and coin exchanged with gloved hands. Entire households left without fathers, or sons, or servant. A sudden silence in a street would cause hearts to still. The plague had become part of them, not as panic, but as shape. A shadow woven into the structure of time. Relics were paraded through the streets, carried not by crowds, but by a select few. Faces veiled, movements slow, sacred objects, believed to hold protective power. In some places, women stepped into roles they had never held before, running farms, managing estates, bartering in marketplaces. The rigidity of class and gender bent under the pressure of survival. Autumn still scattered leaves, but the old festivals, the village processions, bells rang less for celebration, a family singing softly by the hearth. These were not grand things, but they were steady. They gave rhythm to days, otherwise consumed by silence. Music grew softer, a child's drawing in chalk on a boarded door, a woman brushing her stoop, even when no one would come. He saw laundry hung with care, a man tending a window box of herbs, acts of normalcy, in a world that was anything but, dancers fewer. Every motion slow, deliberate, not in grand gestures, but in subtle, almost invisible shifts. Imagine yourself in a small town near the Rhine. Masons, goldsmiths, tailors. A merchant may no longer need fine clothes. A noble may delay construction of a new manor, but require coffins built swiftly. The market stalls, once bustling with fishmongers, bakers, coopers, and spice sellers, are now subdued. Prices have risen, supply lines have faltered. Artisans, once in steady demand, many were gone, lost to illness or flight. Servants were suddenly rare and expensive. Spring still brought green shoots, and weddings, those symbols of hope, became rarer. Faith, too, adapted. Monks and priests sometimes fared no better than the common folk. They too fell ill. They too buried their brothers. In towns like Avignon, where even the Pope was forced into isolation, and through it all, people observed. waited, endured. Children continued to grow, though they played closer to home. Letters, if they were sent, were few, carried not by courier, but by anyone willing, sprinkled with vinegar, sometimes sewn shut. And of course, there were moments of beauty, still, a sunrise glimpsed through shuttered windows, a neighbor leaving bread by the door, the plague doctor walking his route. Not all was fear, and strange things emerged from this altered world. New ways of thinking, of seeing. People began to question old structures. Some turned to science, and slowly, very slowly, the pattern of life began to return. Markets reopened more often. Bells rang for births again. Young couples married under quiet skies. Schools welcomed students once more, but things were not the same. The memory lingered for those who survived, even years later. The beaked mask beyond the grave. The doctor himself has passed from the alleyways. The ledger is closed, the mask set aside. It selects, often labelled in Latin. It came to represent not the healer, the failure to prevent, the inability to save. His stance neutral. The mask is depicted clearly, as are the robes and cane. These images were not caricature, a way for the public to recognize, to understand, or at least to name the figure who moved through their streets. It distills 1,000 scattered lives into a single, repeatable form. How could a figure of such sorrow become a thing of revelry? The plague doctor masked. It was not disrespect. It was worn at masquerades, crafted in porcelain or papier, embure, sometimes in bright colors. The beak was exaggerated. He is the one who walks among the dying. He does not cure. His role ambiguous. He is not the villain nor the savior. A reminder of decay. In art, it continues to reappear. He appears in footnotes, in poems, in ghost stories, sometimes as a literal doctor, sometimes as something else. The robes, embroidered, a costume, a symbol of dread. In visual media, in every version, the mask persists. From history books to horror films, the image endures. The doctor had become a character, and the plague doctor, with his strange costume and solitary role, was irresistible to the eye and mind alike. And yet, he has become a meme, a metaphor, a reminder. He speaks to something deep and shared, the fear of helplessness and the quiet dignity of bearing witness, but as a grim emblem, even when the path is quiet and heavy, where skeletons lead bishops, kings, and peasants alike in one final procession. In later iterations, the plague doctor stands at the edge of the scene, watching, passive, unable to intervene, a witness, not a shield. His presence in a painting or engraving suggested not recovery, but impending loss, not in the form of a name. The dark robes, the long, bird-like. He had once been a man of flesh. Now he was something else. A symbol. Art has a way of preserving what reality. The earliest artistic depictions were practical, even respectful. In woodcut prints and illustrated chronicles of the 17th century, we find him standing alone, but as time passed, and the immediacy of plague gave way to memory, the image began to shift. The beaked mask, once a practical attempt at filtration in the art of the 18th and 19th centuries, the plague doctor began to appear not as a neutral figure. Consider the dance of death motifs. He was also adopted into carnival traditions, especially in Venice. There, long after the last major outbreak, the doctor's mask took on a new life, not as fear, but as play. At first glance, this may seem strange, but carnival is about inversion, about facing what is feared and mocking it, wearing its skin and dancing with it. Writers, too, found the image compelling. In Gothic literature, the Doctor became a cipher, a silent presence in crumbling cities. By the 20th century, the figure had transformed yet again, this time into iconography. But why? Perhaps because the plague doctor represents more than disease. His tools are simple. He is the one who remains when all else falls away. In museums, his mask is preserved behind glass. In festivals, it is worn with knowing smiles. Modern artists, in a time that has known its own waves of illness and isolation, even now, the image circulates in digital spaces. Sometimes serious, sometimes satirical. Because the truth is, for all the fear he may evoke, the plague doctor is not a monster. He is us. He is the part of humanity that continues to walk forward. Here's what remains when the streets are empty and the sky is grey, and all we can do is count, observe, and remember. We often remember the plague doctor as a shadow, a silhouette against shuttered windows, a figure walking through empty streets, his identity hidden behind layers of linen and leather. They were not faceless. They were men, educated or not, ambitious or reluctant, brave or afraid, who took up the mantle of plague doctor and recorded what they saw. And what they saw was extraordinary. And yet, behind some of those masks were stories. They were not myth. Let us begin with one of the most documented, Dr. Matthäus Gottfried Perman, a German physician writing at the end of the 17th century. Though he came after the most devastating waves of plague in the 1530s, treating plague victims with his own blend of herbal remedies and emphasis on hygiene, including cleanliness and fresh air. He rejected some of the more gruesome medical practices of the time, such as blood, though history would later mythologize him as a prophet. Perman's writings preserve detailed descriptions of plague, medicine. His letters and notes described not only treatments. These reports, often just a few lines long, detailed the conditions in particular districts. 3 new cases in the Cale di San Lorenzo, or family at number 12. Refuses. Confinement. They say he was kind. A few survived and continued their work. He did not last the week. Some were inexperienced, appointed simply because no one else would take the role. Others were opportunistic. Paid well. They took the contract, but avoided actual contact. Some even fled after being hired, leaving towns to fend for themselves. They were rewarded with pensions, titles, or city appointments, but others returned to anonymity, their names preserved only in fading contracts or in the back pages of a family's Bible. 2 children are fevered. The mother is quiet. He was known for refusing to flee the city, even as others, nobles, merchants, even clergy, sought refuge in the countryside. Some within days of arriving, the records show their names, sometimes their ages, often their last known visits. They appear as both witnesses and victims, caught in the very storm they tried to navigate. His letters describe his exhaustion. I shall return, but the social breakdown that occurred in the city, people fleeing their homes, refusing to bury their dead, priests too afraid to perform last rites. Hodiana continued to work. He wrote, as many plague doctors did, about what he saw, not only in the body, but in the heart of the community. He compiled stories from those who came before him and tried to make sense of their observations. He noted the symptoms carefully, the swellings, the blackened limbs, though his conclusions were still tied to the theories of the time. Bad air, whether or not he actually wore this outfit regularly, or simply theorized it, remains uncertain. But his name became tied to the image that would endure in history and art alike. Imbalanced humors. There is in his tone a kind of careful hopefulness, an effort to understand. Then there was Jovan Battista Hodiana, a Sicilian doctor who served during the plague of 1624 in Palermo. And there was Dr. Charles Delorme. Delorme was chief physician to 3 French kings, Henry IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV. The beaked mask stuffed with aromatic herbs, the cane used for distance. Delorme's design, as described in medical treatises, was intended to protect against miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. More striking, Nostradamus. Other names have vanished. In Venice, anonymous doctors wrote brief reports to the health boards, civic councils established to monitor the plague. One such report, written in 1631 during an outbreak in Padua, reads simply, "The father expired last night." Even in their brevity, in Milan, a physician named, and there are stories of doctors who did not. In the plague of Marseille, in 1720, many physicians perished. In one letter from a merchant to his cousin, dated August 1720, the following is written. The new doctor from Lyon arrived and walked the alleys with his silver-tipped cane. Some doctors fled. Those who lived sometimes found their reputations elevated. It is important to understand that not all plague doctors were heroic, but among them were also men of conscience, of science, of quiet courage. They held the hands of the dying. They wrote the names in their ledgers when no one else would. They stood between the living and the dead, not as saviors, but as sentinels. And for that, they were remembered. Some in plaques, some in records, some only in the shape of a mask. When memory wears a mask, the world of the plague doctor was, in many ways, unrecognizable now. A world of woodcarts and candlelight, of miasma and musk-scented masks. And yet, when the world grew quiet again in the early 21st century, when cities stilled and streets emptied, the doctor returned, not in flesh, but in image. He appeared online, in paintings, in news articles. At first, it was ironic, a dark humoured nod to the past. But as the months passed, some layer, whether through herbal beaks or surgical masks, quarantine zones or lockdowns, public edicts or personal caution. People joked about adopting plague core fashion, complete with capes and gloves. Others crafted short stories, poems, songs. A mask once designed to ward off air became a vessel for expression of frustration, isolation, even dark humor. He was, after all, a being shaped entirely by crisis. He was not built for comfort or celebration. He was built for quiet perseverance. His presence suggested liminality. He was a helper. The Doctor's image became something more, a reflection of unease, a metaphor for helplessness. The wide-brimmed hat, the long robe, the silent eyes behind dark lenses, all rendered with modern tools, but old meaning. In a world without antibiotics or electricity or instant communication, people still tried to care for one another. They donned masks. They carried herbs. They kept ledgers, not because it would save them, but because it gave shape to the chaos. Articles were written. The beaked mask became a case study in symbolic resilience. In one piece, with something, anything, even if it's only a stitched mask, a quiet word, a step forward, a symbol in plays. The Doctor became a stand-in, not just for pandemic, but for witnessing, for carrying grief in silence, educational posters. He stands as a visual shorthand for all the things we cannot prevent, and all the efforts we make anyway. Others show him cradling the hands of the sick. In these modern versions, we see not the fearsome mask, but the human within, lonely, fragile, and trying. His staff no longer points to the dying. It points to the simple fact that we try. For offering comfort with no certainty. Noun signs reflected on slick pavement. In another, he stands by a hospital bed, head bowed, an emblem of our attempts. On protest signs and street murals, his long-beaked mask re-emerged, not as a forgotten artifact, but as a living symbol. One shared and reshaped by a generation facing its own silent, invisible threat. In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the image of the Plague Doctor circulated widely. There was comfort in his silhouette. Though outdated, his mask was a reminder that we have always tried, always reached for some barrier. In art, illustrators, digital painters, and designers took up his form again. The juxtaposition was powerful, even in theatre and literature, and in digital culture. The image became a meme, sometimes absurd, sometimes poignant, yet beneath the irony, something deeper stirred. The figure of the Plague Doctor. In psychology and in media studies, scholars took note. They began to explore the cultural persistence of the Plague Doctor. How such an image could survive centuries and re-emerge with relevance. What they found was not so much nostalgia, but archetype. The Doctor had become a ritual figure, like the ferryman across the river of myth or the monk in the desert. Even now, his form appears in unexpected places. Tattoo designs, street art, he has been softened. Some depictions now show him as a gentle creature, with a satchel full of flowers, or a tiny songbird on his shoulder. There is something almost comforting in this, in knowing that even centuries ago, and today, we do the same, not with beaks and cloaks, but with gloves, and data, distance and kindness. So the image endures, not because we long for plague, but because we recognize the impulse it represents. To face the unthinkable, the legacy of the plague doctor in modern medicine in the long arc of medical history. The plague doctor occupies a curious space. Not quite a pioneer, not quite a relic. He was a figure born of necessity, working within the limits of his time, and yet, much like the faint smell of dried lavender lingering in an old garment, the influence of his role never entirely vanished. Instead, to trace the legacy of the plague doctor at the institutions and ideas that emerged not in a single stroke, but over time, slowly, like ink soaking into parchment. It begins with public health. Before the age of the plague, illness was seen as divine punishment or misfortune. What began as "Nor you," what began as 40 days of isolation for internuanced policies, for managing exposure, symptoms, and community spread. His presence enforced boundaries. His observations, sometimes clumsy and limited, were still part of the early data. There were healers, of course, herbalists, midwives, the waxed robes, the hood. These were attempts, however flawed, at infection control. And centuries later, during modern pandemics, the principle remains: gowns, masks, face shields. Knock on doors, gather data. Their tools are more advanced, but their mission: they entered homes when no one else would. They witnessed suffering up close. Patients still entrust their bodies and secrets in every ICU, every hospice, every emergency room. Someone walks the same path once trod by the plague doctor, not in leather boots, but in silence. Not with herbs, but with knowledge, and still with the same burden of care. Their presence, cloaked and quiet, was both comfort and dread, has its echoes in the doctor's cane, once used to examine from a distance, or to keep the desperate away, about offering what comfort one can, about bearing witness with grace when answers are few, distancing, sanitation. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, municipal health boards began to appear across Europe. It was not effective by modern standards, but its intention was correct: to create a barrier between the practitioner and the patient. Venice, always at the forefront of disease response due to its trading position, he was a symbol of effort, of care, offered in the face of despair and vast systems of care. It is easy to forget the humble origins of the profession, but beneath the algorithms and the databases, there is still a notebook, a human at the center. His legacy is not in the effectiveness of his methods, but in the fact that he showed up again and again when the world closed its doors. Monks, but no coordinated effort to track or contain disease across populations. They developed systems for quarantine, burial, and sanitation. They tracked cases, imposed restrictions. They served as quarantine spaces, and did what he could. That spirit lives on in every nurse, researcher, and doctor who chooses to walk toward illness, not away from it. Over time, these spaces evolved, shaped by new diseases, new technologies, and eventually new philosophies of care to list symptoms, note progressions, document outcomes. This is now standard practice. But the impulse to record, to give structure to suffering, began long before formal hospitals existed. Doctors were trained in universities, hospitals became structured, but still, the roots of organized response, of centralized health planning and the quiet presence of those who worked among the sick could be traced back to the plague doctor and his contemporaries, unattempted with the tools they had to contain outbreaks. The repeated waves of plague changed that. Faced with the terrifying reality of a contagious, invisible threat, cities were forced to organize. These boards employed notaries, inspectors, guards, and yes, doctors, to monitor the movement of disease. This structure, primitive as it may have been, laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. Even the concept of quarantine, now a cornerstone of disease management, was a gift from the plague era. The plague doctor played a role in these early systems, not as a master, but as a node. His records contributed to statistics. Then there was the matter of protective equipment. The beaked mask, so dramatic in appearance, was in many ways an early prototype for personal protective equipment. The leather gloves. In moments of crisis, the same quiet dance is repeated. Even the doctor's ledger, so seemingly mundane. Some of the earliest isolation hospitals, known as lazarettos, emerged in the shadow of plague, particularly in Italy, built near ports or outside city walls by the 18th and 19th centuries. The medical field had shifted dramatically. Theories of miasma gave way to germ theory. Even today, during outbreaks of novel diseases, contact tracers, public health investigators, and field epidemiologists, plague doctors. Modern medicine continues to wrestle with this tension. The doctor is a figure of help. Even the symbol of the medical profession is the idea that medicine is not always about cure. Sometimes it is about present. That is the truest legacy of the plague. He was not a miracle worker. Today, as public health becomes ever more complex, with digital monitoring, international cooperation, he stood, masked and solemn, between the living and the dead. Now, the streets are silent again, not with fear, but with memory. The plague doctor has walked his rounds. The names have been written, past guarded gates and herb-scented chambers. We have watched the world change around him, watched cities learn to seal themselves, the masks laid gently to rest. What remains is not only history, but a kind of stillness, the soft hush that follows long after the bell stops ringing. He did not always heal. He often could not save, but he bore witness. In stillness, in dignity. He was not a warrior, nor a prophet. He was simply present. In this journey, we have moved through ancient alleys and quiet bedrooms. We have listened to the quiet rituals of mourning, seen how daily life bent but did not break. We've seen how art remembered. The shape of a bird's beak could still stir something in us. The plague doctor did not end the plague. Our challenges are different, our knowledge greater, but the heart of it all is unchanged. And even when we cannot cure, let the sound of their footsteps soften into your dreams, and that in the end, is what lingers. His mask, odd and silent, reminds us of how humans respond when certainty fades. We build barriers, we wear symbols, we write names, we still seek meaning, we still walk toward those who suffer, even when we are afraid. The world has changed since those days of carts and chalked doors, and yet something in the air remains familiar. We still seek safety. So now, as you settle beneath blankets and close your eyes, but as echoes of care, of the long, calm thread of human kindness that stretches from the darkest chapters of our past into the stillness of this night, sleep well.